If you have any questions about the class, feel free to stay after and check in with me. Or if you have any additional questions or just want to say hello to our speaker, feel free to do that as well. We'd love to have you come down and say hi. But in the meantime, let's get started and welcome our speaker today. We have Dr. Melissa Tomasulo from St. Michael's College. She's in the Department of Psychology, and she's going to talk about stress and health. So a warm welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay in the back if I use my teacher voice all the way in the back? You're good? Okay, good. I don't have to worry about a microphone because I do like to move around a little bit. So thank you for the lovely invitation. I've never been to Northern Vermont University, and it's beautiful here. You have a great campus, so I'm really delighted to be here. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about my journey from where I got interested in this research, as well as the current research that I'm doing, how I even got involved in working with scientists at NASA, which I still can't believe that I'm able to do. And I thought at the end I would also talk about, if this is of interest to you, how you can get involved, because you can. And I think that's important to share as well. I'm happy to have questions at the end, but if you have any questions during this, please raise your hand, and I will be happy to answer them as well. Okay, so let me get started here. So I'm going to start our journey today talking about a long time ago in a state not too far away. So I'm actually from Ohio. Some of you might recognize the Cleveland nasally accent, and I apologize for that. But growing up in very rural Ohio, more rural than this, and it's beautiful here. I had a lot of great opportunities to look up, but I also had wonderful opportunities, and I fell in love with Star Wars. Do I have any Star Wars fans in here? A few of you? Okay, thank you. Oh my goodness, you have to watch. You have to watch. If we could have movie night later tonight, I would put them up in here. Star Wars, of course, you know that everyone probably knows the premise, whether or not you've seen it or not. And to me, it meant exploration, and it meant a journey. And I also got to see a female role model who I think is really important in science today. So I also grew up in the 80s, born in the late 70s, grew up in the 80s, and I just had this profound, I thought it was a very magical experience that we as humans were sending astronauts into space, and we were doing really, really hard things. I still have never seen a human walk on the moon. I'm looking forward to those days, hopefully this decade. But for me, it was really profound to see what I was seeing in Star Wars, but coming in real life. So what do you do when you are 8 or 9 years old and you're interested in this? You join the astronomy club. You learn about science and you ask questions. So I've always been asking questions about science. I learned about all the planets. Does anyone notice anything unusual here? In the back? There are 9 planets. Are there 9 planets today? No, how many are there? Yeah, I grew up when there was 9 planets, and I have, Pluto we don't consider a planet. I won't go into the reasons why today. Pardon?
It's an atrocity.
I will keep my opinion to myself, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I grew up learning about science and just having a love for exploration and what's out there. And to be completely honest, which I'm very honest about these things, is I had challenges growing up. And to me, looking up was an escape. It let me feel that my problems were not as big as the universe was. So I went to college, and I went to Baldwin Wallace College, now Baldwin Wallace University outside of Cleveland. I majored in psychology. I minored in neuroscience. Why did I do that? I love science. Didn't have anything to do with astronomy, but I felt like that's where my niche was. I really enjoyed my time in high school learning about how we think, how we feel, what makes us uniquely human. And during that time in college, I got involved in as much as I could. I was involved in research and we had a grant writing experience, peer tutoring. I was a course assistant. I had a love of learning, and I love to problem solve. I didn't have any idea what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I really chose to kind of go and do what I love to do, and I figured I'd figure out the rest of the way along the way. One of the best pieces of advice, though, that I did learn in college wasn't content-driven, but it was this, and that was, you are involved in so much. That's really good in your first couple of years as you're figuring things out. But as you get into your junior, senior year, the better that you can kind of be more focused. Instead of being good at what you do, you could be great. So I encourage you to just think about that. Get involved, but also maybe start to narrow your focus a little bit. So now I was making the decision to go to graduate school, and I went to graduate school at Ohio University. So I stayed in Ohio, as a lot of my peers were doing as well. And I chose graduate programs that were a really good marriage between psychology and neuroscience. But what I really loved the most was looking at mind-body interaction. And I was particularly interested in how our thoughts, how our psychological state could change our physiology, okay? And I was really drawn to understanding and learning more about the response that we have in times of stress. And most of our modern day stressors are not like our ancestors had during evolutionary times. Our stressors today are often things that we cannot see. When we think about the stressors in our lives, we might be having interpersonal conflict. We might be worried about something. We might be worried about something that we can't tangibly touch, something that doesn't obey typical physiochemical rules and physiochemical laws. Yet it changes our physiology in such a way. If I am a zebra and I see a lion, I can engage in the fight or flight response to run away and hopefully not be that meal. That's something I can tangibly see. But we are constantly, as humans, having fight or flight responses, and I'll talk more about that response in a minute, to things that we can't necessarily tangibly touch. Which means if that's overactive, it can be maladaptive and actually could lead to physical illness. So when I was in graduate school, I learned and I studied about the stress response. And I learned things I couldn't even imagine. For example, one of the research papers that I worked on with my graduate advisor was in times of stress, I learned that your blood actually thickens for that short amount of time. Who would have thought that your thoughts and your feelings of times of stress would cause your blood to thicken? Now, you might not notice it. You might not feel that sensation. Don't worry about it. It's perfectly normal. It's perfectly healthy. But what happens is your blood is made of cells as well as plasma, which is more the viscous liquid portion of your blood. And your capillaries actually have pores to them. So as your heart is pumping and as your blood pressure is pumping to deal with whatever stressor is at hand, what happens is some of that plasma seeps out a little bit. The cells remain, they're too large to fit through the capillaries, and your blood thickens a bit. Now that could be an issue if that's repeated, because your heart has to work harder to now push something through your blood vessels that's thicker. If you can imagine if you don't get an oil change in your car, right, and it gets gunked up in the filter, that's not a good situation to be having. Imagine that's over time, and you haven't been coping effectively with stress, that could lead to health problems.
Oh.
Yes?
Is that why the people that have like heart attacks are told to keep stress down?
One of the reasons of why people are told to keep stress down, yes, lots of different reasons. It raises blood pressure when you're under stress. It also leads to your blood thickening. And now let's say you haven't been sleeping, you have a poor diet, you use nicotine and tobacco products, which alone increase thickness in your blood. You could see how your thoughts and your actions could lead to illness. Now, I don't want to leave you with a bad taste in your mouth and think, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed. I'm just going to leave right now. There's nothing you can do. I'm going to tell you about interventions that you can do. And this is if stress is left completely unchecked. But these stress responses are really important because they give us the motivation and the drive to have the get up and go to be able to deal with life's challenges. Another piece of work that I worked on in graduate school is I was learning more about the stress response and really diving into what I enjoyed to do was I also studied, as I gave a little preview to, I studied cigarette smokers. And I was particularly interested in this group because in previous work in my graduate advisor's lab, I asked him, why do we have to exclude cigarette smokers? I think everyone should be included. And his response to me was, you tell me why. I know, you tell me why. So that meant I had to go and find the research, and I ended up developing a master's thesis, a dissertation, and even work at St. Michael's College working with cigarette smokers. And what I was mostly interested in, as I've mentioned, is how psychological stress can lead to illness And what are the pathophysiological mechanisms? What are the biological mechanisms? How is my body changing in response to stress that could then lead to illness and disease? And I was fascinated by that. So here's a little bit of a lecture. I'm not sure how much you already know about the body and the fight or flight response, but essentially your brain, your body has different components of your nervous system throughout your entire body. And one of them, the individual components, is the autonomic nervous system. These are going to be responses that your body does automatically without any cognitive thought, but that can be influenced by cognition. So let me give you an example. When you are under stress, you might feel your heart beating faster, right? How else do you feel when you're under stress? And I encourage anyone to jump in with this response.
You can't breathe.
Difficulty breathing, yes. You feel hot, yeah. Sweating, maybe. What else? How else do you feel? Foggy, little difficulty, yeah. Those physiological changes that are happening are all due to what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And you can see this individual, it must have a phobia of snakes, and is attempting to flee that stressor that he is experiencing. That's all happening automatically on the sympathetic nervous system side. So that's going to be fight or flight. Okay.
There's something else, isn't it? Freeze or something else?
Yes, there is fight, flight, freeze. Yes. You might be thinking about the certain organisms like possums that will play dead when they are experiencing a predator that could be a threat to them as well. Yeah, excellent. So I studied the sympathetic nervous system because that's where stress is. That's the system that's going to be activated in times of stress. Now, this is really complicated. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I want you to remember two things. There are two very important stress hormones or chemicals that your body releases during stress in the two main responses to stress. And it is those specific hormones that make your heart race, that are going to give you the energy to be able to escape your predator or deal with the stressors at hand, that give you the motivation to deal with the homework that you have, the papers that you have to write, the exams that you have to study. And the end result of both of these pathways is that the adrenal glands, your adrenal glands, if you were to make a fist, put them on the flank of your back where your kidneys are located. You can go ahead and do that. It's okay. Your adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidneys. Your adrenal glands you need to have for lots of different reasons in your life. But with regard to the stress response, they are responsible for releasing epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which you experience during fight or flight, as well as a hormone we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, which is cortisol. They're just released from different parts of the adrenal gland, and they have inputs from your nervous system, specifically your hypothalamus of your brain, and they're going to result in activating those physiological changes in the stress response. These are the two main pathways. Why two, right? Well, one, adrenaline is going to be released within seconds. That's going to give you the ability to recognize you have a stressor and make a decision about what you're going to do. Cortisol is a little bit delayed because it has a longer release time, but it's also going to give you the energy to be able to sustain that stress response, because you can't constantly be bathing in adrenaline or bathing in epinephrine. You have to have a way to release more stored glucose and release more energy to get away from those stressors at hand. But for now, I'd like you to remember adrenaline or epinephrine and cortisol. And together, they're going to drive that fight or flight response that I just described to you. All right. So what happens if you're constantly experiencing activation and release of epinephrine or adrenaline and cortisol? So if that's happening for too long of a time, your body goes into a state of experiencing what's called allostatic overload. Okay, and let me just describe that briefly to you. Allostatic overload is when the effects of typical activation of the stress response become too much for the body to handle. So this would be stressors that are chronic, stressors that you're not coping with them effectively, stressors that over time can really lead to many negative mental and physical health outcomes. Okay? So what can those outcomes be? Well, those outcomes can be an increased likelihood of headaches, increased likelihood of risk of a heart attack, a pounding heart, high blood pressure, insomnia, depression, low sex drive, things that none of us in our lives would really want to have. And so when I was in graduate school and at OU and also at St. Michael's, I primarily was studying the effects of allostatic overload on your risk for a heart attack and your risk for high blood pressure. And I was trying to understand those mechanisms by which that can happen. How do you do that? Well, you bring students, you bring individuals into a laboratory, and you put them under stress. Okay? Now, before you change your opinion of me, I made sure that people recovered from the stressful event before they left, and everything was approved by our institutional review board. The stressors that we were having people do in the laboratory, if you're not familiar with this literature, is having people put their hands in cold water, having individuals perform a math task, and also videotaping them while that's happening, and giving feedback that they're maybe not performing as well. Afterwards, you'd fully debrief them, you'd let them know, I was just trying to induce stress because I was recording your heart rate, I was recording your blood pressure, I was taking saliva samples from you so I could measure cortisol, which I just mentioned earlier. Yes, in the back, thank you.
So did you do that every single time you relieve the stress? So the next time they go back in, no matter what you say, they might be like, oh, this shit doesn't mean it. So does that affect your study?
Excellent question. So you're thinking about if I had a repeated measures design where people came in more than once. And I've actually done both. You bring someone in, you have them rest, you put them through stress, you have them recover. And so you look to see how does their stress increase over time. I also had people come in different times, specifically if they were cigarette smokers. And you're right, people know what to expect. Sometimes people don't come back. And what you have to do is called counterbalancing. So the task that I would ask them to do, you do one week, one the other. Because you're right, you could have carryover effects and people could respond in a different way because of that. Excellent question. So when you're thinking about the scientific method and designing your experiments, you have to consider all of those methodological challenges. Excellent, thank you. So this is what I was studying, and I really wanted to understand, how does stress make people sick? But as you can imagine, this kind of got to be not as fulfilling to me. I didn't like putting people in the laboratory and stressing them out. And once I had my job at St. Michael's College, I really knew students, and I really just didn't enjoy that aspect of it. So I wanted to find a little bit of a different angle. And so I decided to research the immune system as well. The immune system, I thought the brain was complex. Some people say the brain is the most complex organ in the entire universe. The immune system is really complex to learn. But my love of learning and wanting to understand all of this was really fascinating. I should also mention my love of space did not go away. Every summer, when I had a little bit of a break, I was reading everything I could get on health of astronauts, every book that I could read. And I also started to understand that astronaut health, particularly their immune system, was a big, major concern to NASA scientists. And so that helped me kind of hone in on what I wanted to do and how I wanted to look at the immune system in a little bit more detail. Okay. So how does stress affect the immune system? I kind of mentioned, and you kind of already figured out maybe how it could affect the cardiovascular system. How could it affect immune system? And it turns out we see cortisol as the main driver here. Okay, another complex figure that I will very quickly, or very hopefully efficiently explain to you. When you're under stress, your body releases cortisol, like glucocorticoids. An example of one is cortisol and adrenaline. But your immune system cells, which have been in the news a lot lately, B cells, antibodies, T cells, other types of immune system cells, they have the ability to change their behavior when they are exposed to cortisol. When are you most likely to get sick? What part of the semester?
The changes between seasons.
Changes in seasons, when you're stressed out, and when are those opportunities more likely to occur? Yes?
the beginning of the semester when everything's new to you, the middle of the semester to midterms, and then the end because you're in finals.
Excellent. Those 3 times, and I've even observed that, and I went through that as well, you're more likely to become ill. So I started to see, okay, when you're more likely to be stressed out, you are more likely to become ill. You're more likely to have infectious disease. Other research shows you may not mount as good of an antibody response to a vaccine. There are lots of different reasons of why stress can affect the immune system. It's probably going to affect your behaviors as well. If you're stressed, you're not going to sleep as well. Is your diet going to be healthy if you're stressed? Are you craving salads and fresh fruits in the Mediterranean diet when you're stressed?
No, Cheetos.
Cheetos are good. Chocolate, right? You're not craving the healthy things that you need. Your immune system needs all those fresh fruits and vegetables to have what it needs to function, okay? So essentially what's happening is stress is causing your body to be bathing in those stress hormones, and then your immune system has the ability to change its function and change the ability to have specific cells that are important for fighting infection. So you're more likely to get sick because of behavior, because activating the stress response, and the main driver, again, is cortisol in all of this. So if we go back to allostatic overload and we're focusing on stress inhibiting the immune function, specifically, stress can reduce the number of lymphocytes, which are just specific types of immune cells, but they're really important. You can decrease antibodies. You can modulate cytokines, and cytokines are proteins that immune systems cells release that communicate with other systems in the body. And if you're not having that communication between cells, you can see why you'd be more likely to become ill. And you aren't just ill with infectious disease like colds or upper respiratory infections. This can lead to inflammation, which can promote cardiovascular disease, which can think about cancer. And it can also, what we call, reactivate latent viruses. Does anyone know what a latent virus is? Have you heard that term before? Yeah.
Isn't it like a virus that's not like kind of hidden, like it's not come out yet?
It's a virus that you have been exposed to previously. Yep. And the immune system, it stays kind of dormant in your nerve endings in your body, but your immune system keeps it in check. Okay. And there's several viruses that we consider to be latent. Does anyone know what they are or have any idea of what they are? Sometimes this certain virus shows up with clinical symptoms when you're stressed. Yes? Herpes simplex 1, yes. Cold sores are more, so if you've been exposed to the herpes simplex virus, which leads to cold sores, they may be more likely to have symptoms when you are under stress. Anyone have an idea what another one is? I have 2 students, unfortunately, that have this condition right now, and they're going to be out for about 6 weeks. You feel really tired, really fatigued. It affects your spleen. Mononucleosis, yeah. Mononucleosis is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. So I had mono when I was 8 years old. Don't know how I got it so early. But I did, and I remember that whole summer feeling really, really unwell. Yes? Shingles is another one, yes. In fact, if you've been exposed to chickenpox, so I'm of the generation where I've had chickenpox. I have natural immunity to chickenpox before the vaccination, so I'm at risk for shingles. That's a latent virus that stays within my body, and it can reactivate. Pardon?
I had shingles when I was 10.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I hear it's very, very painful.
It sucks.
Yeah. So these latent viruses, in times of stress, when your body has allostatic overload, can start to reactivate again. Okay? And the scary thing is, well, good for you, you may not have any clinical symptoms. You may be completely asymptomatic. And it's reactivating because cortisol is changing the immune system so it can't keep those latent viruses in check. Normally, you may never have any symptoms of those illnesses again. But the scary thing is you might be asymptomatic, but you might be what's called shedding that virus. So shedding that virus means that you could potentially infect others. Okay? And this is a really big concern for NASA scientists. If you think about being in a closed environment, in a capsule, on your way to the moon, on your way to the Mars, if you've been exposed and you have latent viruses that are reactivating, that could be a game changer for your mission. Okay, so NASA scientists have also been looking at this problem. But I want to pause for a minute before I go into that discussion, because I also want to mention that there's something that we can do in the presence of stress that can make us healthy. And it's a simple intervention that we can all do. And maybe you already engage in this already. And the whole goal of this is if we can reduce our cortisol amounts, then we don't necessarily have the negative effects on the immune system. Does everyone see that link? Right? Stress activates the stress response, leads to increases in cortisol, which can change our immune system. If we lower cortisol, you don't have that factor that can affect your immune system. So what can we do about this? Well, if you remember, when I showed this slide, I said we were focusing on the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system. That's activated in times of fight or flight. Parasympathetic is activated in times of resting and digesting. Right? We see this part of our body is going to be activated when we are resting, sleeping perhaps, or just sitting quietly, or also when we're digesting our food. Okay? So I want to talk about how we can activate this, because we can activate both. We just don't do a good job of activating parasympathetic side. So there's something called the relaxation response. And how many of you have ever heard of this before? Have you ever heard of Benson's work? Have you studied Benson's work before? Okay, so I'll give you the backstory. So Herbert Benson is the director of the Benson Henry Mind-Body Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital, so a New Englander as well. Also works at the Harvard Mind-Body Institute. And he's a cardiologist, and he was noticing that a lot of his patients as a cardiologist were presenting with high blood pressure. So a cardiologist, he would prescribe beta blockers or another type of pharmacological intervention to reduce the blood pressure in individuals. But they were coming back saying, I'm too tired, since taking this medication. And what he was realizing is that those patients weren't necessarily hypertensive or having high blood pressure. They were nervous to come see him, and so they were presenting with what's called white coat hypertension. So he saw the numbers on the blood pressure monitor, said, you have high blood pressure, we'll go ahead and treat you, and was over-treating them. And he really started to study, again, another mind-body interaction. They were nervous, it was leading to the stress response being activated and increasing blood pressure. He also at this time was studying monks who were engaging in transcendental meditation. And they were not having increases in heart rate and blood pressure significantly. They were seeing healthy decreases. And so he wanted to study this, and he also wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Relaxation Response. And it was published in 1975, and he described the relaxation response as an inducible physiological state of quietude. And he said we can all elicit the relaxation response in our daily lives, but we have to be awake to do it. Okay? And essentially a way that we can induce the relaxation response to activate the parasympathetic nervous system is through meditation and other activities that I'll describe here in a minute. And the most important feature of all of his work, he postulated, and there's a lot of data and a lot of science to back this up that I wish I had time to go into today. But he says, just as there's a mechanism for survival, which is fight or flight, we also have a built-in mechanism that can promote healing and rejuvenation of the body. We just don't tap into this. And so his book was all about how do you do this? And he also said, if you regularly elicit the relaxation response, you're regularly engaging in rest, okay, quietude, periods of quietude where you're decreasing your heart rate and blood pressure. Not only can you help prevent these illnesses that I talked about, these stress-induced illnesses, but you can compensate for and you can reverse some of the damage that you experienced through frequent stress response activation. So I'm not saying that you can think your way or meditate your way out of cardiovascular disease. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that all of the research shows that if you regularly elicit this relaxation response, you can change your body's physiology so that you don't have these over-exaggerated responses, and you can make yourself healthy. So one of the research studies that I do want to share is, after I describe to you how do you elicit the relaxation response. Well, you can elicit this through progressive muscle relaxation, where you purposefully tighten and then relax specific muscle groups. You can engage in meditation or activate the relaxation response during yoga, particularly through, if you've ever practiced yoga, oftentimes at the end you might engage in what's called shavasana, which is you lay very quietly. You might even put a blanket over you, and you just decrease the thoughts in your mind and deeply breathe and relax. Also, you can do mindful awareness, transcendental meditation. You can go on a mindful walk. You hear a lot about mindfulness these days, living in the moment. And that's how you're eliciting this relaxation response. And what I love about it is it doesn't cost anything. It crosses inequalities and equity barriers. But the thing is, we aren't really taught how to do it. And we aren't really taught the effectiveness of how that can be. I wish there could be mindfulness classes or ways to induce the relaxation response from we're very, very young. That also helps with negative affect and a whole lot of other factors. So the science shows us what's the research on this. And particularly, we're interested, remember, in finding a way to reduce cortisol, because cortisol in high amounts is what leads to this chronic illness. So research in 2004 identified that if you are engaging in transcendental meditation, your baseline cortisol levels right when you wake up are lower than people that don't meditate. Okay? And more recent research has shown that not only is your cortisol potentially lower, but in times of stress, your body doesn't release as much cortisol. So let me explain the study. So they brought individuals, Tang and Associates brought individuals into a lab to induce stress, kind of like what I talked about with my research before. They brought them in, and some individuals were in the control group. They had never had any experience with meditation before. And then they also brought in their experimental group, who had been training and learning how to meditate effectively for several weeks before their study. They had them engage in a mental arithmetic stressor, and then they measured their cortisol levels again. So on the x-axis is the task that they were doing, and then salivary cortisol concentration on our y-axis. And you can see those in the control group had greater, significantly greater reactivity to the stressor, as evidenced by release of cortisol, than those individuals who had been trained in meditation. Also, they noticed, well, what happens if we continue and give additional training to those individuals and put them through an even more potent stressor? And we found the same thing. The control group, who has not had any experience with meditation, will have a greater exaggerated stress response. That's really, really important, because that's showing that we have control of something that's automatic, but that with time, our body learns it's really not efficient to be pumping out cortisol in the highest degree as when we are experiencing stress. We don't need that much. When that, of course, means less likelihood of developing chronic illness brought on by that overstatic overload. Okay? Questions? Is this clear? The link, are you seeing the linear link here? Right, awesome. So I mentioned that NASA was really interested in looking at latent virus reactivation, and it was also looking at how cortisol can affect chronic illness. And they noticed cortisol levels in astronauts also increased. So this study was specifically looking at latent virus reactivation, and they, again, wanted to see a link. Can this happen during spaceflight? Can there be this link of higher cortisol linked to latent virus reactivation? And as you can imagine, absolutely. So here, these 3 boxes are looking at, blue is pre-flight, so taking samples before the astronauts have launched, in flight, and then post-flight, okay? Landing is really stressful, and so you will see cortisol levels increase, but the highest during the shuttle days of cortisol was during their mission, which were only about 2 to 3 weeks. Now that we're in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station, most of the increases are going to be during, our stress levels are going to be very, very high during those missions, which means the likelihood of latent virus activation drastically goes up. And I mentioned you don't want latent virus reactivation. You could become symptomatic again, but you're more likely to pass on illnesses to others, which is a huge concern because you don't have the medical facilities and the ability to say, I'm going to take 6 weeks off to really rest, if it's a reactivating Epstein-Barr virus. So it really affects your crewmates and the mission. So I was teaching a new Intro to Health Science class in the fall of 2019. And we were trying, my colleague and I were trying to find research on a unit in stress and health that we thought would be current and interesting that we could share with our students. And we came across that latent virus reactivation study from NASA. And I started to do a little research because you know I love space, you know I wanted to see what NASA was doing. And NASA's Human Research Program, which is based at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, the scientists there have been looking at all the different risks that astronauts can experience, whether they're on International Space Station or in particularly turning their attention to missions to the moon and then to Mars. And they wanted to know what is specifically causing these immune changes during flight, okay? So it turns out that there are changes that occur in the immune system because they're in space, as you can imagine. And those are called flight-related. Their astronauts are exposed to radiation. Even though they're inside the International Space Station, radiation can pass right through. And they're in microgravity. 2 conditions that we don't have to worry about. Well, we do have to worry about radiation on Earth, but not to the same degree that we do in outer space. We don't have to worry about microgravity here on Earth. Okay, so those are 2 things that really can only be studied in humans when we're in space. But they also noticed that there are mission-associated reasons of why the immune system is affected and changes in space. So here, outer space, radiation and microgravity, but these mission-associated challenges, which I'll talk about in a minute, we can actually replicate those here on Earth. Right here is Nemo, and this is a capsule that's at the bottom of the ocean off of Florida. And astronauts can go there, and hopefully you can see 2 faces right here, as well as scuba divers, that are in there in a closed environment. It's stressful, you're confined, you are isolated, you have altered nutrition, you have altered microbial environment, your circadian rhythms or your wake-sleep cycle are all affected. So we can examine mission-associated immune changes here on Earth that are also the same in space.
And I guess if they got like in a fight with another astronaut, they can't really like leave them.
You have to figure that out. And honestly, there's a lot that goes into which astronauts are chosen to go on which flights at which time. And it's all about personality, and you train somebody is really good at one thing or good at the other, but you have to be really effective with conflict management. Because you're absolutely right. You can't just go on a drive. You can't just, if you're having a conflict with a family or a friend, you can't ignore them for a period of time and call them later. The critical mission support that you have and the effectiveness of that mission is bound by you figuring those things out. Yeah. So these are things that we can study on Earth. And all of these have an effect. They change our immune system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here on Earth, here in space, what happens? Let's talk more about those changes that happen in space and on the International Space Station. What psychological stressors can you imagine if you're in the International Space Station? The astronauts make it look easy. It's beautiful out, to see the Earth. But what happens? Yes, thank you.
I mean, I'd just be worried about the structure in general.
You're worried about what? I'm sorry?
I'm worried about the structure in general, the integrity of the structure.
Yeah, the International Space Station is aging, right? The International Space Station has been built for 20 years, and you might have some concern about, is the structure that I'm in okay? It is. We have challenges that occur every once in a while, but we have not had our capsules sent to the moon yet and to Mars yet. When humans do go, there'll be testing, but these are going to be validation flights. Excellent.
Miss their families.
They miss their families, yeah. And astronauts will say they can call home regularly. They can text. They get video calls once a week in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station. But when we head to Mars, it could be up to a 20-minute delay. So having those one-on-one conversations is going to be really challenging. So I might say, "Hi, Dad." 20 minutes later, he hears me. He says hello. 20 minutes later, I hear him. It depends on where we are in orbit and so forth. But it could be a really long delay where intermediate communication is not necessarily going to happen. Interpersonal conflict, mission stress. These are all factors that we need to be considering. Physiological stress. It's hard. Space is trying to kill you. You can't just go out in space. You have to wear your EVA suit. You have to make sure that you are hydrated. Astronauts will say after spacewalks, it's exhausting. It isn't this, just the serene scenery. And they'll often say, I really didn't even take a time to really look at the Earth and experience. I just was so focused. Radiation, as I mentioned. Hypoxia, CO2. We breathe out CO2. There has to be CO2 scrubbers in our capsules, in our space stations, in order to take out the CO2 and make sure that we have the oxygen that we need.
Is that kind of like getting the bends when you go diving?
Yeah, and in fact, astronauts will say they do feel where they keep the carbon dioxide, they're not able to get it out as much as it is here on Earth. So it is like that if it's not effective. They have to constantly be watching that. They have their microbiome altered, their nutrition is altered, right? You only have the food that comes up on our resupply missions and what's there. Right? So a lot of things are obviously different. Microgravity, circadian misalignment. So you don't just wake up at 7 a.m. and go to work and go to bed at a certain time. There are new people that are arriving on the space station. You have to adjust your sleep-wake cycle for different missions. And so you're constantly almost being jet lagged. These are stressful events that cause cortisol to increase and then can lead to a sequelae of immune challenges. So cytokines, latent virus reactivation, et cetera. As we go to the moon and as we go to Mars, we're going to have new risks. These are longer missions, up to 3 years. We could be at risk for cancer. We could be at risk definitely for consequences of persistent viral reactivation. And this is what we need to be paying attention to and figure out these problems now. So what can we do to reduce these risks? NASA is all about reducing risk. And they can develop what are called countermeasures. A countermeasure is an activity or an intervention that can reduce and prevent a lot of these factors and these challenges. And NASA scientists have written a countermeasure protocol to help astronauts' immune systems be healthy during deep space missions. They have a whole protocol of what they think would be effective or what you could imagine would be important for maintaining astronaut health. So countermeasures. These are the countermeasures. What are some things that we can do? Well, we can screen people before the mission to make sure they're healthy. Astronauts to this day go into pre-quarantine about 2 weeks before their mission. They enter quarantine periods to make sure that they aren't exposed to any pathogens that could make them ill during the mission. They can be vaccinated for certain conditions. They can make sure that they have an exercise protocol. Exercise increases the health of your immune system. Yes?
Haven't they found that health is pretty integral to space travel, or physical activity is?
Yes. Yes, exercise. If we think just beyond the immune system, when astronauts go to space and you're in microgravity, your body doesn't have to take on the weight-bearing load that it does here on Earth when we have gravity. And so your bones actually thin. And so that's a huge problem because astronauts would be at risk for fractures when they come back from space. So a countermeasure that researchers have effectively identified is astronauts spend about 2 hours a day exercising every day. And you can't feel like not exercising that day, right? We've all had those days. And I don't exercise 2 hours a day.
I have that year.
Pardon?
I said I have that year where I don't feel like exercising.
Exercising for that year? Yeah, yep, we all have those times. So a good countermeasure to prevent bone loss when you're in microgravity is resistance exercise and, of course, cardiovascular exercise to keep you healthy. So maintaining those exercise protocols is also really important. So monitoring for any type of illnesses is also really important. So I was particularly interested in stress management. So they proposed that stress-relieving breathing exercises for 20 to 40 minutes a day would be effective at hopefully reducing what hormone that I talked to you about today? Cortisol, thank you. If we can reduce cortisol, we know that can affect the immune system. So my colleague, Professor Dagan Loisel at St. Michael's College, we were teaching that Intro to Health Science class together. And we were like, he's a geneticist and an immunologist. I'm a psychologist researching stress. We were reading these papers to include in our health science project, and we said, we should do a research project together. And those are the best kind, right? You get your friends, and you get something that you're really excited about. And you do a research project. So we wrote a research grant to the Vermont Space Grant Consortium. And we also, part of that was you had to have the backing of a NASA scientist. So we did our research, we found some individuals that we thought we might work with, and we were brave and said, I'm just going to email, and in this case, Dr. Brian Crucian, who's the lead immunologist virologist at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Emailed and said, can you tell us a little bit more about your protocol that we think we could help? And the next thing we were having a telecon, that's NASA speak for a phone call, a telecon, and we were designing this research study together. We wrote a research grant that received funding from the Vermont Space Grant Consortium, and we were on our way to developing and working together with NASA to try to figure out a way that we can reduce stress. So what we did is we came up with this novel, what we thought a novel way to reduce, to engage in some type of an activity to increase the likelihood of the relaxation response being elicited. And so we thought that virtual reality might be a really good method by which we could take individuals and engage them in meditation that's delivered through a VR headset and try to reduce their cortisol levels and then help with this one small component of this countermeasure. Now, have any of you ever used a virtual reality headset before or seen that? Yeah, okay. I wish I had enough time to bring ours today and have everyone try it for those of you that haven't. But it's technology that's very immersive, right? You don't remember you remember, of course, but you're in a completely altered universe. You know, our brains are wired to live in one universe at one time. But here we're in one place, but we're experiencing another whole dimension. It's immersive. And we thought, because another colleague of mine had a virtual reality lab that we kind of did some research in, I thought this might be a really good modality because astronauts, if you're traveling far away, and you're in a capsule for about a year on your way to Mars, you're going to probably want to remove yourself a little bit as best you can from that environment. And being in a virtual environment might be a really effective way to do that. And by the way, astronauts also train with VR equipment for other types of things too, and so they're already used to this technology. Now I know what you're thinking. VR is the furthest thing away from meditation, where you're supposed to be quiet and have your eyes closed and relax. But there are certain, as we were doing our research, there are certain commercially available apps that you can use to elicit the relaxation response that I'm going to talk about that can really be effective or we want to find out if they're effective at reducing stress. So we had to figure out how are we going to develop this. And what do you do when you want to develop this technology? Is you talk to an astronaut. We were given the amazing opportunity to speak with astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor. She's an astronaut physician, and she's flown on the International Space Station for two specific missions. And so what I didn't share is that we had this wonderful idea of what we wanted to do for our research project that got grant funding. We submitted our grant, I think it was March 5th, 2020. What happened shortly after that? COVID, which meant everything had to change. Everything had to change. But one thing is, in the summer of 2020, when we had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Chancellor, is we asked her, will this work? Will this be comfortable? What do you think? And I also said, what do people want to see in a meditation? What would an astronaut want to see? Would they want to be meditating and looking out and seeing a stream or a mountain and earth? Or would that be triggering because you're a year away from our home planet? And so this right here, I realize it's probably a little bit challenging to see in the back. This is Earth, and this is the moon from Mars. That's an image from Mars. So that's what you'll see if you were to kind of like look in your rear view mirror of your capsule. It could be triggering to see mountains and streams, or you might miss it, but some people might be triggered by that. So we needed to come up with a VR meditation that you can have your eyes open, be fully immersed in, that didn't necessarily only have components for Earth. So our first study, which was in fall of 2020, not at all what we had hoped that we were going to be able to do. We planned on bringing people into a lab, having them wear a VR headset, having them meditate, record their physiological changes, record their cortisol. But we couldn't have any contact with anybody in our laboratory because of COVID, and nobody was vaccinated at this time. So our research questions and the goals were, we wanted to see, is academic stress enough of a stressor to release enough cortisol in order to see, does that affect neuroendocrine and neuroimmune function? Does it affect viral shedding in college students? We had the unfortunate added stress of the pandemic, but we didn't know if academic stress would be a good enough analog for where we could look at these changes. And we also wanted to see, can a VR meditation mitigate the effects of stress? Can this lower cortisol enough? We didn't know. So we had funding from the Vermont Grant Consortium. NASA scientists decided to help. They asked the Human Research Program to match our funding, and we also received funding from the Vermont Biomedical Research Network. And I feel really thankful to be able to do research during the pandemic, because not everybody was able to. So our protocol was, we had our participants come and first pick up, we screened them for different health characteristics, and we had them come into our laboratory, and they were given supplies to self-collect saliva and urine to measure immune and neuroendocrine function. And they collected saliva samples every Tuesday and Wednesday, and then they filled out behavioral questionnaires that I'll talk about in just a minute. And then we would meet them outside in the middle of our quad with a cooler, and their saliva then their tubes in a little bag without touching, have them put it in there, and then we would pick up, wash everything, put it in our freezer. So this was literally like contactless research. Then we had a select group of our participants starting in the 5th week. We had them come in to our lab, socially distance, and learn how to use the VR headset. And then we gave them a VR headset, and we said, we want you to use this headset for the next few weeks. We showed them how to engage in the meditation activities. So this was the plan, right? And then we planned on having a certain group of people in the experimental group do this for 4 weeks, others in the control group not receive a VR headset. And then we would test them before, during our countermeasure, and then after. Well, COVID again challenged everything, and we ended up going home in week 7 of the study. We all had to go remote. Okay, so we hurried up and grabbed those materials back, but we still had some data. So we also were looking at, just to tell you a little bit more about that, we had 20 students that actually signed up for the study. And our final end was 16, 10 males, 6 females. We actually had some students contact COVID. So we immediately had to have them removed from the study because we couldn't have biological samples that had the virus of COVID in our lab at all. And that also meant that a couple of those individuals were in our VR stress relieving countermeasure group, but all of them ended up mostly being in our control group, so we have uneven ends. So our VR meditation app was TRIP. We delivered that through Quest and Quest 2 VR headsets. That's the device that we used. And we had individuals respond every time they engaged in a meditation. We wanted to know where they were they seated, were they laying down, how deep do you think your meditation was, how long did you meditate, and also did you do any other non-meditation or non-VR meditation during those days? Did you go to yoga class? So we really wanted to look at meditation as almost like a dose response. So instead of how much medication are you taking, how much VR or how much meditation are you doing? Because remember, we wanted to be able to match the relaxation response induction to decreases in cortisol and hopefully subsequent viral shedding. And our only ask was that we say, can you just do this at least 4 times a day for 20 minutes? Okay, so we also have to figure out how much is effective. So we also had individuals fill out questionnaires once a week on their stress. We used the perceived stress scale by Cohen. We also looked at positive and negative affect as measured by the PANAS X. And we also asked them to fill out questionnaires on physical activity and their sleep. So we had the intervention or the countermeasure, we had the behavioral measures, and then as I mentioned earlier, we took physiological measurements. We measured cortisol, we measured latent viral shedding, and other measurements of the immune system, as well as cortisol measured in urine. Okay. So what did we find? I wish I could tell you. We just got the data back. NASA analyzed all of our samples for us, and this, of course, it ended in fall of 2020. They weren't even set up to receive the samples because they were shut down because of COVID. So they didn't even receive our samples until the summer, and then due to their personnel being out and keeping everyone safe. So we just have this data back. I was hoping that I would have more to share. And we literally just have it back. But I am going to go ahead and talk about study 2 because I think this is also important and it kind of gets at kind of where the research is going. So in spring 22, we did the same study, except that we wanted to add in academic and job stress. And I'll be honest with you, we really wanted to give back to our students that were first responders. So St. Michael's has a fire and rescue program. And we really wanted to do something for our students that were first responders in a pandemic. And so we did the study again with them, and we had the added bonus that they had already began or completed their vaccination status. So that was really important for us to feel safe and that they felt safe. And so we did the exact same study, except that we decided we weren't going to have a control group necessarily, that we were going to have everybody receive the VR, some for 8 weeks and some for 4. So our intervention would be a little bit longer. And we thought we'd make things even more interesting. And we had all of our participants, they received their VR headset and they received a Fitbit, just like this, that monitored their sleep. It monitored their circadian rhythms. It monitored their physical activity, and it moderated all their heart rate as well. So we have all of this data, as well as what I just talked about. Yes?
This probably doesn't matter, but after you were done with the data question, were they allowed to keep the Fitbits?
They were not able to keep the Fitbits. They wanted to keep the Fitbits. I think many of them purchased their own afterwards. I wish that we had the funding to be able to do that. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
So I wonder when you said like your participants had 20 minutes 4 times a day.
4 times a week.
Oh, 4 times a week?
Yes.
Did you put like a time of day, like say like one day for 20 minutes they have to do it like in the morning by this time, or like midday or in the evening? So I feel like that would have an effect.
Yes. What do you think? What kind of effect do you think that would have? I love that question. I love that idea.
Less cortisol in the morning because you don't have to deal with the day's crap.
Yeah.
You actually have your highest cortisol. You wake up, 30 minutes later is your peak, and then you slowly start to see cortisol decrease throughout the day. it is the opposite of melatonin levels, which helps you to sleep. But you're right, we just said, just do this. If you could just find time to meditate, but you're absolutely right, time of day, and in our spring study that's coming up, we are gonna have to look at that. Because we had a couple students say, the only time I could do it was in the evening, particularly our first responders that had a really busy day, but they fell asleep with it on. And to engage in the relaxation response, you have to be awake. So I'm glad that it helped you sleep, but that's not what we're particularly looking for. Yes.
How was the Fitbit able to determine they were sleeping? Was there a sleep mode? Or?
Yes, so in the Inspires, the Inspire 2, which we use, it can detect heart rate, and there are different types of heart rate activity that happens throughout the night when you're sleeping. For example, in deep sleep, it'll be lower. And it also is like an actigraph, so it has sensors to realize when you're still, but it's not foolproof. It's not an EEG, but it's the best thing that we have to be able to send people out. But yeah, excellent point. So it also can monitor body temperature now. So they are devices that they can. I'm not selling Fitbit. I don't work for Fitbit or anybody here. Although if they want to give me anything for free, I'm not going to say no. But yeah, great questions. So this, again, don't have the data yet because now NASA's analyzing our spring data, and we're obviously not pressuring our partners because we're just excited to partner them. But with this coming spring, though, we are going to do what we really wanted to do was we want to make sure that VR meditation is really reducing heart rate when you use it. It's not too stimulating. We want to make sure that it's reducing blood pressure. And so we're going to bring people into our lab, use Trip, the meditation app VR, and we're also going to record heart rate variability, which is an indication of parasympathetic activity, and electrodermal response, which is skin conductance, and then we're also going to measure immune measures and salivary cortisol, because we want to make sure that this VR type of meditation does the same thing that a regular meditation does. And again, we couldn't do this last year because we couldn't be in the lab with individuals. And we're really excited because HTC Vive Flow, this is a brand new device. It's lighter, it's more comfortable, and we are partnered with Trip, but we are working with, hopefully, HTC Vive to use that technology as well, because it'll become, pardon? And I'm not selling any of this. Again, if anybody wants to give them to me, I'm not going to say no. Okay, so that's where I'm excited to see. Questions about this? So I want to bring it back to our parallel research with NASA. Okay, so remember, these devices, and one of the reasons we're really excited about the HTC devices, it costs so much money to launch things to space. And if you are thinking about launching to the moon and you're going to stay there for a while, or you're thinking about launching, and staying in Mars, you can't be having all of these heavy headsets. You need to have something small and lighter. And the HTC Vive we're here is about the weight of your cell phone. So obviously much easier to transport. And the device is changing all the time. So while our St. Michael's College is a good ground for us to figure out, is this even going to work on Earth? And by the way, I really am a big proponent of whatever I do for research. Yes, I want it to help astronauts, but it needs to help the majority of us who are not going to go to space. So people here on Earth. But NASA, anytime they're going to test their technology, particularly a protocol that could affect the immune system, they need to test that here on Earth. And so we call that ground-based analogs. You can go into NEMO, which I showed you earlier. There is an area in Hawaii which simulates Mars missions, and they'll send people there. There is Antarctic Winter Over, which I'll be primarily spending time talking about, and also Hera, which is at Johnson Space Center, and they will put people in this closed environment for a month, 45 days, and they want to see, okay, what is the stressor like? And they screen you to make sure you don't have claustrophobia, obviously, and they want to make sure before we do anything in space, we need to make sure that we're going to test this in terrestrial or ground analogs here on Earth. So I mentioned Antarctica. And so Antarctica is a place that's an extreme environment. It's isolating, it's confined. Circadian misalignment is off because there are days when you don't see the sun, and you're there for a long time. You don't just get on a plane and leave Antarctica during winter over. So this is during the winter period of Antarctica. So it's a really good analog for the International Space Station or for space flight. Now, it's missing two things that I talked about that are important during flight. What's missing here? Microgravity and radiation. Excellent, right? So we can't simulate everything, but we can simulate what it's really like to be isolated in an extreme environment, because that's what it's going to be like on the moon. That's what it's going to be like as we go to Mars. So NASA scientists have written a whole protocol, including Dr. Brian Crucian, who we've partnered with, has about these ground analogs. And so they've done their own research to figure out what areas of Antarctica that are more easily accessible that would be good ground analog studies. So this is Palmer Station. Palmer Station, if we're looking at Antarctica, it's right here, it's coastal. So it's not at the South Pole. So the weather's a little, I wouldn't say it's nice, but it's a little different than at the South Pole. It's not as cold, but it's still winter over. You know, you go there and you're not leaving for several months. So we can have research participants go there and engage in the same protocol that we would want our astronauts to engage in. And then after winter is over, then we can have their biological samples and be able to assess how effective the protocols were. So firstly, NASA had to make sure that Palmer Station was a good analog, because it's not interior Antarctica. And they found out recently it is. It's a good analog. So what's going to be starting in March of next year is they want to take, if you remember I showed you the entire countermeasures protocol, of which stress management was one in that box. They had exercise protocols, vaccination, diet. We were invited to be a part of this, what we call suite of countermeasures that will prepare astronauts for deep space missions. So we need to make sure, do all of those countermeasures work, right? And so they might not work at St. Michael's College because it isn't as stressful, but let's see if they work in Antarctica. And so beginning next year will be a control season, which means there won't be any countermeasures at all. It'll just be a time where research participants go down, and it's all organized by the National Science Foundation. So research participants will go down there. They won't use any VR headsets. They won't have any meditation or dietary changes or exercise protocols. They're just going to live their life. Then starting in winter over, which starts in March, another group of individuals will go down, and then another group in 2024, and they will be engaging in those countermeasures. So I'm learning research takes time. You have to be patient. It takes a long time for your data to find out what the results are. The goal, of course, is that all of these countermeasures together. So the nice thing is they're not just looking at them individually. They've already established what countermeasures they should have. So they invited us. If this works, it will be validated for flight on the International Space Station in 2025, and will then become a protocol. So if you were traveling to Mars, or first to the moon to prepare for the Mars missions, these are the protocols that you will be engaging in. Exercising, vaccination, because you are not going to have the same resources that we have here on Earth. So I'm just delighted to be given the opportunity to take something that I love to study and now be able to research it and partner with NASA. Thank you. Yes.
Are you worried about unforeseen stressors?
Yes. Could you have any in mind that you can think about?
I don't know. Space madness? I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. NASA will of course choose the best astronauts for the mission, but there are a lot of unforeseen things that can happen. And the other thing is, you're not going to be able to call mission control and say, "Can you help us troubleshoot this?" Because there could be a 20-minute delay. So you need to make sure that whoever is going is trained. And this is why we haven't necessarily gone yet. We have a lot of things to still figure out that could be unforeseen circumstances. And meditation and other types of, again, we're looking at it for the immune perspective. There's also the NASA scientists that are in human performance and cognition that are really focusing on how do we make sure people are going to get along together. What if someone becomes clinically depressed or clinically anxious? What can we do then? Right? We try to train for all of these scenarios, but there are things that happen. So yes, there is a concern. Yeah. Okay. So ways that can we reduce the risk to spaceflight? And I just wanted to point out, NASA their human research program has a human research roadmap. And you can go there now, and they tell you all the things that they're concerned about and what they still need to study and still figure out. And you can then figure out, do you want to research this? How can you help them? I have found that the scientists that we've worked with at NASA are extremely welcoming. They wanted to make sure we're legit, right? But they're very welcoming. They want the help. They want to partner with academic institutions. They love that we have students working on the projects. And the Vermont Space Grant, NASA gives all 50 states a specific amount of money every year. And it's up to each state to determine who receives those grants. And the purpose of those grants is to help NASA scientists be able to reach academic institutions and work together on these missions. So right here you can see our study is on their research roadmap, an upcoming study funded by the Vermont Space Grant in collaboration with the Human Research Program. Will explore how hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, cortisol, can potentially affect latent viruses. We'll also be doing a ground-based mission in Antarctica here, and then hopefully it'll be an International Space Station, depending upon how all that works out. So again, back to this image that we've already seen. We have a lot of ground to cover before we can make it to Mars, but there are steps that are being made. And this is just the immune part, right? I haven't talked, if you didn't hear me mention rocket at all. I am not in physics. I wish I had that knowledge as well, but there's a whole lot of challenges that still have to be figured out. But there's progress, of course, being made. So you might be asking how you can get involved. Read. If this is of interest to you, read. Pick up books. Read about astronauts' experiences. Listen. There's a podcast, many podcasts that is put out by NASA. It's called, of course, the most popular one, Houston. We have a podcast to mimic Houston. We have a problem during the Apollo missions. And there's specific ones on all the risks and challenges. So read and listen. Ask questions. In your classes, ask. Email researchers. Ask me. And I've loved how interactive you've been today. Thank you. Take coursework in STEM. Right? I'm so thankful that I've had the experiences that I've had with my research experiences to be able to have the knowledge to do this kind of work now. The Vermont Space Grant Consortium gives undergraduate students stipends and the opportunity to write your own research grant to help. And by the way, if you receive one of those grants, you give a talk at a NASA facility and you get a tour. So I've taken students to NASA Ames in California, and I've taken students to NASA Glenn in Cleveland, the students that I had worked with before the pandemic on other NASA-related funding opportunities. So there is an opportunity to do that. Faculty members can apply for Vermont Space Grants as well. And NASA has internships. Instead of just internships here, NASA has internships that you all can apply for as well. Look at that human research map, and you'll be on your way to finding more information. So I'd just like to acknowledge today as I end my colleague, Professor Dagan Loisel, our collaborators at NASA, Brian Crucian and Myra Nelman, the Vermont Space Grant, NASA's Human Research Program, our funding agencies, undergraduate research assistants, Dr. Tartleton for the invite, and all of your participation today. I really have appreciated my time here. So thank you. I hope this is informative. So are there any other questions that you may have? Yes, thank you.
It's not necessarily a question. I am wondering if you go back to the slide related. Was all the? It was one of the last ones.
That one?
That one.
Yes.
Feel free to go, guys. I know we're just at time here, but if you have questions, feel free to please stay.
Yeah. Thank you.